that she is here. Daniela, are you ready?
I am ready.
Wonderful.
So
Welcome.
let me see if I can see everybody who's on. Okay. Oh, yes, some family is on as well. So hi, kids. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to watch this. My name is Daniela. I am from Brazil, but I've lived in the United States for about 20 years now. And I wrote a book called The Diary of Asser Levy. And it's a book that the story of this book is real, it's history, although it's a little bit controversial, like exactly what happened, because it was like 400 years ago. But anyways, what I wanted to share with you is because growing up in Brazil, I always heard this story because Brazilians know the story. But here in the United States, like people haven't really heard, and it's the story of the first Jews that arrived in America, the first group of Jewish refugees that arrived in America. And that was like in 1654, which is a long time ago. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of this book. And I know some of you may have read it already, but some of you didn't. So I'm just kind of going to give an overview of everything that happened. And it's really interesting history. And let me see if I can do this successfully here. Hold on a second. I'm going to share the screen. Okay. Can you guys see the screen? Okay. Can you see that? The notes, Daddy? Okay, great. Okay, so on the footsteps of Asser Levy's journey. So this is also the story of like all the places that I went to retrace the step of Asser Levy, who was one of the first Jews that arrived in America. So, and I started writing this book in 2015, which is a long time ago. And actually, when I look back at the pictures, like my daughter was really teeny tiny, and you can see how much time has passed between when I started writing it and now, when it got published right before the virus thing started. So it's kind of a crazy time for me right now as well. But there's different versions of this story, and I kind of like, I did a lot of research for it, and I traveled to different countries, and this is a possible version of what happened, even though there's a little controversy as to exactly what happened. But I don't know if you guys all know, and if you have any questions, you can do that raise hand thing on the chat, and they'll ask me if you don't understand something. But Europe in the 1600s was not a really happy place. Like a lot of the time, it kind of looked like that. And those people who were being tortured and killed were mostly Jews who lived in Spain. Spain had about 380,000 Jews who lived there. That's a lot of people. And the Inquisition was a time when the Spanish king and queen said that everybody who lived in Spain had to be Catholic. So the Jews had to convert to Catholicism, or they had to flee, not live in Spain anymore. And there was no other option. And if you were pretending to convert or anything like that, you would be tortured and killed. So about 300,000 of the Jews who were living in Spain at the time converted. But about 80,000 of them fled. And where did they flee to? Because Europe was all kind of a dangerous place because of the Inquisition around then. So this map shows all different places where Jews fled to. And this was called a diaspora, like in the Holocaust, where Jews just spread to all these different countries because they were running away. But a lot of the Jews went to this country here on the north called Netherlands, which is Holland. And why did they go to Holland? Because in Holland, they practiced a type of existing that included tolerance. Now, I don't know if y'all know what tolerance means, but it means like being okay with other people and how they are. Like not everybody has to be the same and not everybody has to be the same religion, and we can all get along. Well, most countries in Europe weren't like that, but Holland was. Holland in the 1600s was going through its golden age. So in the law in Holland, they actually wrote in the law that people had the right for freedom of conscience. Freedom of conscience means you can believe whatever you want to believe, and we're not going to kill you or persecute you or burn you or anything like that. And that was very rare in Europe. Because of that, a lot of refugees from all over who were different religions, they went to live in Holland. Also, Holland was one of the most rich countries in the world. It owned a company. It had a company called the West India Company, which is kind of like Walmart or Apple these days, where it's just like this huge company. And it had branches in Brazil, it had branches in the Caribbean, and it had a branch in New York, what is today New York. In this picture, you can see like this large building on the right side. This building is the synagogue that was built by the Jews in Amsterdam. And unlike in the rest of Europe, where people, because of the Inquisition, were hiding and doing underground synagogues and doing, praying secretly in their homes, this building shows you how huge the Jewish community in Holland was and how received and well received they were and how rich they were. And this is a picture of me inside that synagogue. This is the synagogue in Amsterdam. It was built in the 1600s. And if you look on the right, you can see that it's exactly as it was. Like, it didn't change at all. The chandeliers are still there. The chairs made of wood from Brazil. Everything is exactly the same. It wasn't destroyed by any of the wars. It wasn't destroyed by the Nazis. It's really an amazing sight to see. And this is a map of Brazil. And Brazil was a Portuguese colony. And all the green area was colonized by Portuguese, but this orange area here, for about 25 years, from 1625 to 1654, the Dutch fought with the Portuguese and they took over that whole area. So all the green area was Catholic and had Inquisition, and all the orange area was tolerance. So a lot of Jews who were living in Holland who were of Portuguese descent, they went to Brazil to live and work in Brazil and be free, and they could practice Judaism, and they built a synagogue, and it was considered a colonial Jerusalem. And the story that I write, the beginning of the story takes place where it says Mauritsstad there. That's the town of Recife in Brazil. And that's what it looked like back then. It was a little town. You can see the little houses and a bridge. And this is what it looks like today. So it's kind of grown. And here's a map of the old Recife. And this circle here represents the approximate location of where the synagogue was. And that is me and my daughter standing in front of the synagogue. It's called Kahal Zor, Israel. And it's the very first synagogue that was built in the Americas, in the New World. It was built in 1636 by the Portuguese Jews who came from Holland. The first rabbi in Recife was sent by the Dutch West India Company to be the rabbi in Recife. His name was Rabbi Aboab. And from the synagogue, the people actually asked the first rabbinic consultation from the Southern Hemisphere. And that's because there really weren't that many Jews in the Southern Hemisphere, and all the Jewish law was written for the Northern Hemisphere with the rains and the months and everything. And then suddenly they were in the tropics and things were at the opposite times. So the rabbinic consultation was, should we pray for rain between the months of Tishrei and Nisan as the other Jews do throughout the world? Or should we adapt our prayers to the seasons of the year in Brazil? And they got an answer from Greece, from the rabbi of Greece, and he said that they were to not pray for something that would harm them. So that's just a little interesting tidbit about the synagogue in Brazil. And so the main character of my book is Asser Levy, but in 1654, we don't really know that much about him. So what we know about him was that he was an Ashkenazi Jew, meaning he wasn't from Portugal or Spain. He was actually from like Germany or Poland. And he was, at some point, had moved, or him and his family had moved to Amsterdam. They were fleeing also from something bad and had moved to Amsterdam. And in 1654, he appears in New Amsterdam, which is modern New York. So that's what we know about him at that point. Now, we also know that this is a picture of the minutes of the synagogue in Recife. And there is a signature called Benjamin Levy. Benjamin Levy was the shochet of Recife. The shochet is the kosher butcher. And it's possible that maybe Benjamin Levy was Asser Levy's father, because we know that one day Asser Levy also becomes a butcher. But we don't know that for sure. It's a theory. And what would have Asser Levy had looked like? If you could see him today, this is not him. None of these pictures are him, but are paintings that I pulled up of young men from the early 1600s and with Dutch outfits. This is what the Dutch used to wear. And he would have worn a hat like this and this kind of collar, and he would have had a beard. And perhaps this is what he would have looked like as a young lad. And my story begins in 1654. So that's an important year, because in 1654, the Portuguese fought to get back the land that the Dutch had taken from them. And they did. They reconquered that whole orange area that you saw on the map. It went back to Portugal. And what the Portuguese did is they said, all of these Dutch people and all of these Jews who are living here, you have 3 months to leave. So this happened in January, so they had until January, February, March, April. Around April, everybody had to leave Recife, just scram back to Europe. And my story takes place in one of the ships that left Recife, which was called the Valk, or the Falcon. It was a Dutch ship, and it sailed away from Recife on the 25th of February of 1654, and there were about 23 Jews on this ship. And they were looking forward to starting their life anew somewhere else. This is a picture of me and my daughter in front of a ship that was probably similar to the Valk, and this is in Amsterdam, and it's a replica of an old Dutch ship. And this is what it looks like inside the ship. So the passengers of the ship would have slept somewhere like this. And as you can see, my daughter is really enjoying her little stay in the ship there. However, the Valk ran into some bad news. They didn't really make it back to Europe as they thought they would. When they were in the Caribbean, they were caught in a storm that may have looked something like this. And their ship was damaged, so they were just kind of sailing along, hoping to bump into some safety. But they didn't bump into some safety. They bumped into some pirates. And the pirates attacked the ship and looted the ship. So that means they stole almost everything that the Jews and the other passengers had. They already had very little, and they were left with nothing. And this is probably what the ship looked like after the pirate incident and the storm incident. So when they landed in the island of Jamaica, they probably felt pretty happy that they were saved. But sadly, Jamaica was a Spanish island at the time, which had the Spanish Inquisition. So there go the Jews again into the Inquisition prison. So they were imprisoned, and some of them stayed in Inquisition prison, but many of them, after some time, were let go. And after they let go, they got lucky again because they found this guy who is not really this guy. So I don't have a picture of what these people were, but I have a picture of what I think they looked like. So this is a Dutch captain from the 1600s, and our character, Captain de la Motte, was a French captain from the 1600s who was sailing back from the Caribbean back to Canada. And the Jews, they couldn't use their ship, which was damaged, so they took a ride with this guy, the 23 Jews, and he said, I can drop you off in New Amsterdam on my way to Canada. And New Amsterdam is a Dutch colony, and you'll be safe there. So they accepted the ride, except the ride cost a lot of money, and they did not have the money to pay for the ticket. So they made a deal with the captain that they would all put whatever coins were left, whatever money was left that they had, which is about half of the fare, they gave it to the captain, and they said, when we arrive in New Amsterdam, we'll give you the rest of the money. And they probably thought that there were going to be some Jews there to help them to pay the rest of the fare, but they didn't know what was going to happen. This is kind of the route that the ship took. So it left, so the Valk left Brazil and traveled up towards the Caribbean, and somewhere up there in the Caribbean, they took the St. Catherine, which was Captain de la Motte's ship, and they sailed all the way up to modern day New York, Manhattan Island. And on September 7, 1654, they arrived in Manhattan. And this is what Manhattan looked like back then. There was a Dutch windmill, there was a Dutch church, and some houses. And this is the St. Catherine with the 23 Jews getting off and being rowed to the shore. And on the left here, on the right here, you see another ship, and that ship is called the Pear Tree, and it had arrived from Amsterdam just a few days earlier. And there were actually 2 Jews on that ship that had arrived right before these 23. 2 or 3, like nobody knows for sure, 2 or 3 Jews. And here's another picture of what New Amsterdam looked like back then. And just as a reference, that's what you would be seeing today. And so this is another picture of New Amsterdam. And after they arrived, they found out that they were the first Jews to arrive, and there was nobody there to help them pay for the rest of the money that they owed to the captain. So the captain was pretty, can I say the P word, pissed? Like, he was pretty mad. He was mad he was not getting his money. So the very first thing that happened as soon as the Jews arrived is that the captain went to the court and he sued the Jews for not paying for the rest of the fare that they had promised to pay. And this is the exact wording of the lawsuit that he filed. And some of the words that are highlighted there, you can say insolitium, which means that the Jews had paid a lump sum, but they didn't have enough money to pay for the rest, so that all of their stuff that was still on the ship was going to be publicly sold in an auction. And Solomon Peterson, who was a Jew who had arrived on that other ship I showed you guys, he acted as their attorney, and he helped to give them 24 hours extra to pay for the fare. And also, we know that there were 23 Jews because of this lawsuit. It says there were 23 souls, big and little. That means there were adults and kids in this group of Jews. Well, this lawsuit went on for a long time, and the Jews were caught up in it. They had their things were sold in an auction, and some of them went to jail called debtor's prison, but eventually all that got resolved. In the meantime, just a few days after they arrived, it was Rosh Hashanah. And we assume because there were probably 10 men to form a minyan at that point, that on September 12, 1654, was the first Rosh Hashanah that was celebrated in America. Now, after the lawsuit, the Jews probably thought things were going to be good for them, but they didn't know that their troubles were just beginning. Because this guy, his name was Peter Stuyvesant, he was the Director General of New Amsterdam. That means like he was like the governor. And he did not want the Jews to stay. And he wanted to deport them. Do you guys know what deport means? Kick them out? Yes. So this is the letter that Peter Stuyvesant wrote to the Dutch West India Company saying, you got to get these people out of here. We don't want them. And if you read them, you'll see that this letter is filled with words that are not nice to Jews. So the Jews who arrived here would like to stay here, but with their customary deceitful trading with the Christians, they were very repugnant to the inferior magistrates. They are going to become a charge in the winter, means like they're going to be a burden to us. And this deceitful race with such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ be not allowed to further infect and trouble this new colony. So as you can see, Peter Stuyvesant didn't want the Jews to stay. Well, but the Jews fought back. They knew that they had rights. They knew that as being Dutch, that they had rights that were religious freedom rights and citizen rights. And so in January 1655, they wrote a petition to the West India Company. And in this petition, this is the actual picture of the petition they wrote, and you can see that in the museum in Philadelphia, that they were saying, these 13 points, basically they're saying, we arrived here in poverty. We came from Recife, where we fought with the Dutch against the Portuguese. We are Dutch citizens, so we should have the same rights. We are loyal. We work for the Dutch West India Company. We can pay taxes and make money for you guys. In other words, they really made a list of all of the reasons why they should have the same religious rights and the same citizen rights as all of the other colonizers. And they sent this letter to Holland. And in time, Holland wrote back and they told Peter Stuyvesant that the Jews could stay and that they had rights. But that was not enough. Like, there's another letter from the Protestant preacher in New Amsterdam, and he also didn't have very kind words for the Jews. And he wrote not to the West India Company, but he wrote to the Protestant organization in Holland and said that the Jews wanted to build a synagogue here, and we request your permission to send these godless rascals away. And we already have papists, which are Catholics. We have Mennonites, we have Lutherans, Puritans, Independents, and various others. And it would create still a greater confusion if the Jews came to settle here in the service of the Divine Ward, Reverend Megapolensis. So they were still trying to kick them out. Now, this is another attempt that the Asser Levy and some of his colleagues, they tried to join the army in New Netherlands so that they could defend the colony against Indians and against outsiders who wanted to invade, and they wanted to help. They wanted their citizen rights to be in the military. But Stuyvesant said, no, you can't join the army. Nobody wants to be around you. And because you cannot serve in the army, you have to pay extra taxes. is really what they said. So the Jews sent another petition to the West India Company complaining that their rights were not being allowed, that Stuyvesant was not giving them their rights. And when the West India Company heard of this, they were really upset. So they wrote Stuyvesant a letter and they said, "We have seen and heard with displeasures that against our orders, you have forbidden the Jews to trade and to purchase real estate. And we wish this had not been done and that you had obeyed our orders." So as you can see, like, Holland was not happy about this. And basically, at this point, Stuyvesant kind of started agreeing that they were going to stay. This is a picture of a Torah that arrived in New Amsterdam from Amsterdam in 1655. Amsterdam is the capital of Holland. And with the arrival of the Torah, the congregation officially established itself. And they formed the synagogue, Shearit Israel. Shearit Israel is the first Jewish congregation in the United States. It was founded in 1654 by the 23 Jews of Spanish and Portuguese descent. The first building was built in 1730 on Mill Street, and this is the building today. Inside the synagogue, that's my daughter again, and this is Mr. Zachary Ettinger, who will be very happy to give you a tour if you want to visit the synagogue. My daughter is holding these remenim, I think they're called, the caps of the Torah handles. And these remenim are actually were put on the Torah at the inauguration of the very first building in 1730 on Mill Street. And the light here in the bottom, which is the eternal flame, has been going since 1730, since the building was open on Passover Day, actually. And the rock that you see there is a millstone, which they used to grind wheat into flour. And the synagogue was on Mill Street, which means that these rocks were on the same street where the original synagogue came from. And now they're inside the synagogue. You can still visit them. The first Jewish cemetery is also in New York. You can see it if you go to Chinatown. It's a tiny little area that between buildings, people just walk by it all the time, but this is one of the oldest cemeteries in New York, and one of the oldest graves in New York from 1683. And the person who had died there is called Benjamin Bueno de Mesquita, and he was one of the residents of Recife, Brazil. And finally, in August 22nd, 1664, the English take over. So the English were about to completely eliminate. They had a bunch of ships on board with cannons pointing to the city. That's Peter Stuyvesant standing with his wooden leg and a letter in his hand from the English captain saying, "Surrender now." And the people are saying, "Please, let's just surrender because they're going to annihilate us." And so Peter Stuyvesant did surrender. And he went back to Holland in shame. But he came back to New Amsterdam about a year later and lived the rest of his life in his farm in the Bowery. And I don't know if you've heard of this neighborhood in New York called the Bowery, but that comes from a Dutch word that means farm, and that's where Peter Stuyvesant's farm was. And his statue today is on that land, and his grave is on that land, and it's right next to this church, St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. He died in 1672. And this is a map of New Amsterdam, and it's very detailed and has every single house and little plot of land and every little tree that they grew is in this map. And this is the area, what it looks like today. And in this map, you can actually see Asser Levy's house, which is in that little square. If you look closely at the square, there's two houses next to each other, and the one on the left was Asser Levy's house. And he was the first Jewish homeowner in America. And that's what his house looked like. And that's a description of his lot and location. Everything is in the Dutch documents. And if you go to New York today, this sign here says South William Street with Mill Lane. That near that corner is where his house used to be. And the courthouse where all the court battles were fought for religious freedom is in this little square here. If you make it bigger, you can see that that's kind of a big 2 or 3 story house. And if you go to New York today, that's what it looked like back then on the left. And on the right, that's my husband and my daughter sitting there. There's a yellow square on the floor, and the square is the location of where that building used to be, the courthouse. Also, like New Amsterdam had, on the edge of New Amsterdam, there was a wall, and that's where the soldiers were put to protect the colony. And that wall is where Wall Street in New York is today. And if you go to New York today, you can see these little squares on the floor that mark the location of where that wall was. And so New Amsterdam becomes New York. But the cool thing is, New Amsterdam was such a different place. It was a cultural melting pot. It really was. There were people who lived in this town who were Dutch, English, Scottish, French, from Belgium, from Morocco, from Germany, Italy, Bohemia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark. There were African slaves and free Africans. There were Native Americans, and they all lived peacefully side by side. There were 18 different languages spoken in this town, and there were tons of religions. There were Dutch Reformed, that was the Protestants. There were Lutherans, Mennonites, Baptists, Quakers, Muslims, Catholics, and Jews all living together side by side. And so you can see that New York's identity today comes from this multiculturalism that was already in New Amsterdam. And when the English took over, they signed a document that this is a reproduction, this is a picture of that document, that they wanted everything to remain exactly as it was. They didn't change a thing about New Amsterdam. And if you look at article number 8, it says, the Dutch who live here shall enjoy the liberty of their conscience in divine worship and church discipline. That means now the English colony of New York is going to have religious freedom too. And all of this is thanks to Asser Levy and his friends, his Jewish friends who arrived in the 1600s. And Asser Levy became the first Jew to be granted citizen rights. He was the first kosher butcher in America. He was the first Jewish homeowner in America. He became one of the wealthiest men in America. And he worked as a merchant, as a real estate developer, as an attorney. He lent money to people. And when he died in 1682, about 400 New Yorkers owed money to him. And New York honors him by several public structures. So there's a bathhouse named after him, there's a pool named after him, and a park. Oh, and that was my last slide, which didn't kick in, but it's all the pictures that I took of me in this joyous trip, in this joyous journey. Let me see if I can find it for you guys here. In the meantime, I will take any questions that you guys have. And I also want to, oh, here, can you see that? That's like, that's mainly my daughter, because I was the one taking pictures, but this is in Brazil, in New York, and Amsterdam, and all these different places we went to find documents. And we had a blast doing this all together. And just something I want you to think about. How is this story still current? And what are the parallels between this story and what's happening today? So.
Thank you. It looks like we have a few questions. I know Sophie, let's unmute you. There you go. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you have written any other books? And if not, are you thinking of writing any other books?
Yeah, I have written, let's see. I have 2 books written in Brazil, which is where I'm from. They're like picture books. So they're about worms. So nothing to do with Jews, more to do with nature. And I'm also an illustrator, so I did all the illustrations for the books. So I have 2, it's a little series. And I write a lot of articles, like history and science articles for children's magazines. And this is my first middle grade book. Am I going to continue writing? Yes. Even though it's torturous, right? Because it takes so long until your product finally exists, until you finally give birth, but it's worth it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Did we have any more questions? Don't go to New York now.
No.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? We can unmute everybody for a little bit and you have
What you need from me on RP? The Bible papers that you can write tabs on.
Oh, we're unmuted.
You're unmuted.
Yes, don't take any
Write on
questions.
there what it is or do it later. Tabs. Found a whole box of them. Yeah, but what do you?
What's your favorite?
Call me. Okay. I'll start working because I know y'all are working on it tomorrow.
Yeah, I've been working. It's just like I get stuck because like
I'm very curious that if any of you can
nobody
find
help me.
anything.
Okay. Oops, I'm going to remute everybody, but I'm giving you the option of unmuting yourselves if you want to ask a question.
So in just thinking about the story of the Jews arriving in a place and the governor wanting to deport them and they don't have where else to go, does this sound like anything that you guys are familiar with that might be happening right now?
Coronavirus.
How's that? Are there any hands up? So I'll just, since there are no hands up, I'll just give you some clues, okay? But in the world today, there is a refugee crisis going on. Have you guys heard about this? About the refugees? So there's a lot of people still who are fleeing from one country to another because of religious persecution, because of wars, because they've been kicked out of their country, and they're trying to go to different countries. Some of them are even trying to come to the United States, but when they get to those countries, the governors or presidents or whatever, they say, no, you can't stay here. I'm going to deport you. I'm going to kick you out. So there's a lot of these things that when you read stories from the 1600s, when you read stories from the Inquisition, when you read stories from the Holocaust of people trying to leave their home because awful things are happening there and just trying to make a life in a new country and having a lot of hardships in doing that. So there's a parallel between the stories that are still happening today and this story. Do you guys all see that?
Yep. Yep.
Do you have any more questions about?
What influenced you to write a book about what you did, what you wrote about?
Can you repeat the question, please?
What influenced you to write this story?
Let's see. So I kind of always knew the story, but I didn't know the real historical details. So I was really interested in them, but it was really like when I found out, when I asked people here in America if they knew who were the first Jews who arrived in America, like people were saying, oh, in the 1800s, there were, you know, the Jews came from Europe because of, you know, this war or that war. But actually they arrived here in the even before New York was what New York is today. I mean, they came here so long ago, and very few people really know the story. So that was really my inspiration, that I wanted everyone to understand the real story of the first group of Jews who arrived here.
Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a teacher, and I had studied this history with one of my students that I tutor, but it wasn't unfamiliar to me, but I just really appreciate your excellent research, because good historical fiction is based on research, and you did a masterful job, and I hope you'll do more of this kind of thing for teens.
I'll just show you guys like my, like tons and tons of papers, and there's even more than there is here, just trying to be organized with all the research that I did over these past 5 years, 6 years. And once you start researching, it just becomes like a thing, and you just like get obsessed with the story. And I kind of wish that you could go back in time and see what really happened, and speak to Asser Levy and speak to Peter Stuyvesant. But yeah, and I just want you guys to know that my book is, because I really wanted to write it as nonfiction, which means I wanted to write exactly what happened, like historically. But because there are so many pieces of the story that are missing, that we don't know what happened between this and this, I had to write it as fiction. But inside the book, like, you'll see that there are a lot of these sidebars with historical explanations. There's a lot of pictures. There's Asser Levy's house, and I have a timeline. You have a whole section of all the different places that you can visit that were named in this story. So it's kind of like a tour guide almost. So, I tried to put in as much history in the book as I could.
I have a question.
Yes, I think that's my brother from Brazil.
Yes. What happened to the West Indian Company?
The West Indian Company went bankrupt. So, and I think that happened, if I'm not wrong, because like all these large companies, like suppose it's Apple, right? So Apple relies on everybody buying like iPhones for them to keep doing business. And at the time, like one of the big money makers for the West India Company was the price of tulips, which was a type of flower that grows in Holland, and it was very expensive, kind of like how oil is expensive today. And the price of tulips, for some reason, it really dropped. Like it was one of these, like, how the market crashes and the price of tulips dropped. And I think that's kind of what did the West India Company in. But I also want you to know that not everything in here was like glorious and rosy, because the West India Company was also involved in the triangular trade, which is bringing Africans into North America to be sold as slaves. It wasn't necessarily that the Dutch were using slaves, but they were participating in that trade.
What point of view was the book written? Like, was it the narrator's point of view, or?
So I wrote it as a diary. So I just kind of had to think like what would be happening to Asser Levy, and it's all written in like a diary format.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
I wanted to also say, was it your decision to do the open dyslexic typeface? Or how is that decided upon? Because I work with children who have learning differences, and I really appreciated that this book was printed in an accessible typeface for
that's good,
more
really
readers.
good to hear.
I don't
Yes.
know if people can see.
Yeah, it's open dyslexic. The font is a little bit different than the regular fonts in books. And I don't know if you can see that, but that was because original idea was that this was going to be a diary and it was kind of going to look a little bit like handwritten. And the publisher thought that was a really good, you know, sort of opportune timing with putting the Open Dyslexic font, which already looks a little bit different. And that could create like an even bigger readership for the people who have dyslexia. And I'm curious to ask you a question. Do you have experience with this font, and is it really helpful for dyslexic people?
Well,
I have a little bit of experience, and yes, it seems to, for whatever reason, be easier to access for my students that I work with.
Oh, good.
And it does make a difference. And the degree of the different ability has some bearing on it, but for people who are slower readers, it just helps them speed up and feel like they're getting the continuity of the story and not just sounding out the words.
Oh, good. Okay, well, I'm glad to hear that. Does anybody else have questions?
Yeah, I had a question.
Yes, Helen. This is my mother-in-law.
The people who came from Holland, were they only descendants of Spanish Jews or also Portuguese? Do you know?
So there were Spanish, so there were still Spanish Jews who were fleeing, who went, you know, via different countries and ended up in Holland. And there were Portuguese. So there were Spanish who had gone to Portugal and stayed there for a number of years and then went to Holland. And then there were just Portuguese. So there was like a blend. And there were people from other places too, but it was really like the Spanish and Portuguese Jews were the big community in Holland.
So
they were very wealthy, very, very wealthy.
So they're mostly Sephardic.
Mostly Sephardic, but there were some Ashkenazis too, and Asser Levy was one of those Ashkenazis. So there was things going on in Germany and Poland at the time too. And so the big difference between the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardic Jews at this time in Holland, like the Ashkenazis were mainly farmers. They came from like agricultural backgrounds, and the Sephardic Jews were these, you know, bankers, traders, merchants, and so they were like money people. And back then, they really were kind of racist towards the Ashkenazi Jews. They were very separate, those two communities. And interestingly, like until today, it's very separate. The Ashkenazis have their own synagogues and the Sephardics have their own synagogues. But the synagogue that they formed in New York in 1654, Shearith Israel, is one of the only ones that have both Ashkenazi and Sephardic together.
Well, Rome is something different. There were no Ashkenazim and Sephardim.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. And you can always write questions to me. Like I can make my email available to you guys, and the link is if you guys want to buy the book. I have several links. You can buy from Amazon if you choose to have it shipped Prime or something, but you can also buy from your local bookstores to help them with their business. So I have several links that are going to be made available to you. And I would love to have reviews on wherever you buy the book from, like Amazon or whatever. And it was really a pleasure talking to you all. And I hope that you learned something and that you didn't know before.
Thank you so much for being with us today. It was really a pleasure learning with you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna sign off then.
Thank you everyone for being here. Chag Sameach. Have a wonderful Passover.
Bye.